Good afternoon. Let me begin by reiterating my pledge at the time of our inauguration to work cooperatively and professionally with Governor Rauner, despite the events that have transpired since the time of our inauguration. I continue to maintain the number one problem facing the state of Illinois is the budget deficit. I feel that the governor's cuts-only budget slashes medical services for the elderly, the disabled, and struggling families. I think we need a balanced approach to solving the problem of the budget deficit. We need cuts in spending, and we also need new revenue. As an example, the legislature has already passed Senate Bill 788, a bill which would reduce Medicaid spending by $400 million. Concerning our continuing efforts to meet the governor halfway, we've taken 5 concrete steps. Number one, the House has passed a workers' compensation bill. The Senate has passed a workers' compensation bill. I have instructed Representative Hoffman, who's the chair of the Labor Committee in the House, to open discussion and negotiation with Senate sponsors towards reconciling the differences between the two bills. Number two, the House has passed a bill which would privatize the operations of the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. Number three, for the 12th time today, the House has called a bill which would freeze property taxes for 2 years. Number four, the legislature has sent to the governor a bill which would suspend the anticipated COLA adjustment for members of the legislature and would keep level of spending for the per diem and the travel allowance. And today, again, we responded to a governor's request by passing a bill which appropriated federal money plus money for a debt service payment at McCormick Place. So those are 5 instances where, in my judgment, the House has taken action to meet the governor halfway. This is an opportunity for the governor to move toward conciliation with members in the legislature and to take positive steps towards drafting a budget for the state of Illinois, which will meet the needs of the state of Illinois. I'd like to comment on events today, and I truly regret comments made by House Republicans where they characterized as poison pills efforts by House Democrats to help women with breast cancer and children with disabilities. These are not instances where these people requested this disease or this disability. These are people that are struggling through life, women with breast cancer, children with disabilities, and House Democrats today attempted to include appropriation items in the appropriation bill which would address these problems. And for our effort, they were characterized as poison pills. I take great exception to the use of the Rauner Republicans in the House of language such as poison pills when we're trying to help women with breast cancer and children with disabilities. So, Amanda, do you have any questions?
Of course I do. I have plenty. Why bother calling this, however, when you knew that Republicans were going to say no, that the governor said veto? Said, is that really compromise, or was there a way to have gone about it differently?
Let's understand that we were talking about 5 programs where there's clearly a connection between the federal and the state participation. LIHEAP, which is 2/3 federal, 1/3 state. The 1/3 state money is an item on the utility bill earmarked by statute for the LIHEAP program. The money will not be spent unless it's spent on LIHEAP or unless the legislature changes the statute. And I don't expect the legislature to change that statute and take that money away from poor people where the money is intended to help poor people on their utility bills. Number 2, breast and cervical cancer. I've spoken to that already, and there is a direct connection between federal and state money. And if the state money is not spent during the budget year, the federal money must be repaid. Early intervention, federal match requires initial general revenue fund outlay. And then in the case of Meals on Wheels, here again, if the state money is not spent, then the federal money must be repaid. And in the case of child care assistance, there is also a federal-state linkage. So we've clearly made the case that in these 5 instances, there is not only a history of shared federal-state participation, but there will be a federal requirement attached to spending in these programs. That was the purpose for attempting to include these 5 items in appropriation along with the appropriation for the federal money. The Republicans wouldn't support us today. My prediction is that before the end of the current fiscal year, the administration will be appearing before the legislature, explaining to the legislature why they need this appropriation of state money to meet requirements in these programs put on the state by the federal government.
Do you have an estimate of what that number might be? The governor already said no, so why?
Well, because you're very familiar with the governor's history of U-turns. Okay, we have a long document that sets out the U-turns by the governor, and he could have done the same thing today, but he chose not to. And they chose to use language like poison pills when we're attempting to help women with breast cancer and children with disabilities.
Just a point, when you say women with breast cancer, this is really for screenings? Doesn't that include healthy women who just are being screened to make sure they don't have it?
We are talking about breast cancer, aren't we?
We are, but not necessarily victims of it.
I thought I was a little confused. I thought we were not talking about breast cancer.
Mr. Speaker, under the legislation that passed today, do you have an estimate of how much the state might have to pay back if a full budget?
I'm sure we could. I'm sure that Jessica could give you an estimate, if not today, why sometime within a matter of hours.
So this does not have a direct connection. It says 4 of 5 require expenditure of state funds.
Well, the LIHEAP program has a direct state component where there's an item on the utility bill where the money goes into a state fund.
State law that adds to it.
Adds to the program.
Out that portion.
The federal money could be spent without regard to the state money. My point is that today under the statute, that money is earmarked for helping poor people on their utility bills.
So does the early intervention money cannot be spent until there's some GRF money available?
Or does Illinois lose money because we're delaying? Like, what is the situation there by not doing this now?
Sure. In the case specifically on early intervention, there is a Medicaid component. So like with all Medicaid spending, it requires an initial outlay of state resources. We present that bill to the federal government. They send us a reimbursement back. That applies to much of the federal funding for early intervention.
So by like waiting, will Illinois lose money, or as long as it's appropriated sometime this fiscal year, Illinois will get it back? You know, by not doing it now, is there a problem?
I would say that it depends ultimately at the end of the fiscal year how much resources we've put towards funding for those programs to determine whether or not that we lose money.
What's the difference between this amendment that passed today and the one that was introduced that did not pass? Like, what's the financial changes that we're saying?
The amendment that was ultimately adopted to the bill and was passed by the House does not include the state components for any of these 5 items. It only included the items that were passed by the Senate and some additional items, some of which were requested by the governor's office.
So what was the final dollar amount of the additional federal money that was in this?
The additional federal money would be approximately $435 million.
What was that for?
That includes funding both, there are additional federal funds available for the Department of Education, the State Board of Education, and federal funding that will flow through IEMA for Homeland Security preparedness.
So rather than a $4.8 billion federal fund, we're talking about 5.2.
I think it's interesting to note that the the governor's office and the round of Republicans in the House did not object to the appropriation of state money for McCormick Place in Chicago, an item that was in the original spending plan sent to the governor, which he vetoed, because he didn't want to use his powers under the Constitution to use the line item veto or the reduction veto. So the round of Republicans in the House objected to appropriating state money for LIHEAP, breast cervical cancer screenings, early intervention, Meals on Wheels, and child care, but they did not object to spending state money on McCormick Place.
Is that all going into a mailer?
Excuse me?
Is that all going into a mailer?
You know, I'm glad you made that point, because we've noted that the Republicans are way ahead of us on mailers and TV advertisement. But there's a question on the amount of money for McCormick Place.
That is, for their debt service payments, the amount is $166.5 million.
And that's state appropriation.
Yes,
State
it's non-general funds, but it is state dollars.
Speaker, what do you think about the governor's office today, or his attorneys, talking about consent decrees and basically saying that that has tied their hands with the budget, and frankly, it seems like they were saying there's too many.
Well, they agreed in the Circuit Court of Cook County before Judge Larson to a court order which covered those consent decrees that they're now complaining about.
Mr. Speaker, given how much money has gone out the door with consent decrees and various other operations, I mean, how much are we spending right now, and what might that deficit look like at the end of all of it?
That's the purpose of the hearings which are being conducted by Representative Bradley in the House Revenue Committee. They just started yesterday, and our purpose and our intent is to develop a count on how much money the governor has agreed to spend during the current budget year. And so, number one, the governor agreed to the order by Judge Larson in the Circuit Court of Cook County. Agreed. Number two, he signed the appropriation for elementary and secondary education. Number three, he sought and got the order in St. Clair County, which provided for the issuance of the paychecks. And if you add all three elements together, you're very close to 100% of what the governor estimates will be available to spend during the current budget year. I say estimate because that's the purpose of the Revenue Committee, to take testimony and to work with the lawyers that are appearing in federal court to update the consent decrees. And so it's sometime in the near future, the House Revenue Committee will be in a position to speak to your point, which is how much money has the governor obligated himself to spend in the current budget year. It may well go over 100% of what he estimates will be available.
So what happens in that case?
Well, then we're going to go back to the governor's campaign rhetoric about cutting costs and eliminating cozy insider deals.
The governor's been out a couple times in the past week saying that Mayor Emanuel is on board.
Did you see him?
To limit collective bargaining. Well, this was 2 appearances in Chicago last week. Says the mayor is pushing to limit collective bargaining at CPS. Have you talked to the mayor about that? Has he suggested he's on board for that?
I'm not going to characterize the mayor's statements on that particular issue. What I know is that Governor Rauner consistently talks in terms of either repealing or resetting collective bargaining, especially for units of local government and school districts. That runs up against the core beliefs of both Democrats and Republicans, because they know that repealing or resetting collective bargaining reduces wages in the standard of living of middle-class families. They know that, and they don't support that.
What do you predict will happen with the CPS bill? There was an earlier hearing today on that. Moving forward, do you imagine there'll be changes? Is it something you can come on board to?
Our purpose in the House is to provide an opportunity to have a hearing on the bill and an opportunity for anyone who is interested in the bill to appear before the committee and to provide testimony and help all of us better understand the bill. It's a multi-component bill, and our interest would be in fully understanding the components of the bill and the ramifications of the bill. That's our intent.
Mr. Speaker, do you think operating in this manner with these consent decrees is good or bad for Illinois? What's your opinion of how the state is operating?
Did you know that we're in continuous session?
I did. The little bird told me.
All right. Okay, very good, very good. I would prefer that the state government, through the cooperation of the executive departments and the legislative department, would be fully responsible for the management of state government. However, there are outstanding consent decrees in the federal court. Governor Rauner agreed to a court order in Cook County. Governor Rauner went to St. Clair County and got another court order to issue the paychecks. And so we are where we are. There are multiple court orders, consent decrees. We're going to do our best to work our way through all of these conditions. My desire would be that, again, in cooperation on a very professional basis, that the governor and the legislature would be fully responsible for the management of state government.
Is it possible this is going to go on like the entire fiscal year, and what effect would that have long-term on the state, to run on consent decrees and court orders?
Well, I'm going to do my best to maintain my pledge to work cooperatively and professionally with the governor. I think I've done pretty well to date. I made the pledge in January. I'm reiterating it today. I'm fully committed to it, to be cooperative and to conduct myself like a professional. And it would clearly help if everybody involved in this process would do the same thing.
When was the last time there was a meeting between everyone involved, especially the leaders and the governor?
A little bit ago, and I don't recall the exact date, but a little bit ago.
Do you think there need to be more meetings? Would that be helpful?
Well, I would hope that meetings would be helpful. You know, I would hope that that the meetings would help us solve the problem.
Well, this dispute, I don't know if you want to call it a dispute or an impasse or a standoff between the House Democrats, for example, and the governor, whatever it is, what are the acceptable losses in that difference?
What do you mean by losses?
Well, I mean, certainly the state fair is not an acceptable loss, and the police cars around the road, you gotta have those. You know, would it be that social service component where providers are not getting paid and people are gonna be left hanging? I mean, is it okay that those people don't, for the greater good of having one against the other side here at the Capitol?
My desire is to work professionally and cooperatively and to solve the number one problem facing the state of Illinois, which is the budget deficit, doing that with a balanced approach. Some cuts, some new revenue. We've already done the bill on Medicaid that would reduce spending in the Medicaid program, and all through the spending plan that we sent to the governor, there were reductions in spending. That's consistent with my view that the number one problem facing the state of Illinois is the budget deficit, and that to solve the problem of the budget deficit will require a balanced approach. That's going to be my approach. There are multiple elements in a state of Illinois budget and in spending by the state, and anybody that's interested in any of those elements can make a persuasive case that they ought to continue. It's our responsibility to work our way through that and do it on a balanced basis. That's our goal.
Well, the Democrats still plan to have a Democrat Day at the state fair. And it would look like past Democrat days.
The Democrats will be at the state fair. I understand the Republicans will be there on the Governor's Day at the state fair.
You usually don't like to speak for anyone else.
Correct,
so
yeah.
I'm asking about the Democrats. The Democrats are going to have the same kind of day as typical at the state fair.
We're gonna have some unique features, and you might want to be there. Okay. We'd be happy to see you.
Mr. Speaker, what do you make of the governor not doing bill signings publicly? Is that strange to you?
Oh, I think that's the, that's the governor's decision.
Well, would it help to build some goodwill with lawmakers to give them a nice public area to sign their bills for?
I'm going to work professionally and cooperatively.
How long can this go on?
Amanda, what do you got?
Well, I have two. First of all, we talked about Democrat Day. Are you getting involved in the U.S. Senate race and picking a Democratic candidate in that at all?
Not to date. Not to date.
Do you plan on it then?
Well, I would say that the Democratic Party is very fortunate that we have so many people that are interested in running for the United States Senate. We're blessed because at times political parties have a hard time finding people to run for office. But in the case of this year's Democratic Party, why we have several people that want to run for the United States Senate. Your next question would be?
Yeah, do you expect to choose one of them or have DPI do so?
Not to date, and that's something for me to decide as I move along.
And Bernie Sanders has done very well in a poll in New Hampshire, I think. Any thoughts on that, or is the party getting involved in the presidential?
The Democratic Party is blessed to have multiple candidates that wish to be candidates for public office. And you're right, Mr. Sanders is drawing big crowds, and he's doing fairly well and showing levels of support. But you see, that speaks to the vibrancy of the Democratic Party, and which has always been the real genius of the party, that it can attract different types of people, but then come together in a general election.
So why is there not going to be continuous session in the chamber itself next week? That's the first time you're not.
We are in continuous session.
I understand.
You know that, right? Continuous session?
Got it.
Logistically, how long can you keep coming? I mean, can it go into next year when you start discussions for the next fiscal year? I mean, how does?
We're in continuous session. We're on the job. We're at the job. We're going to fulfill our responsibilities as members of the legislature in terms of budget making and in terms of any other issues that come before the General Assembly, whenever that may happen. We're in continuous session.
But you're not going to be in the building next week. You're not.
Well, you see, we've issued a tentative schedule, right? And our caucus, who was told in May, and we reminded them several times, they should be prepared for a 48-hour call at any time, that they should be prepared to come here on 48 hours' notice.
Mr. Speaker, given how much money is going out the door and how it's not that different from the budget Democrats initially passed, does that underline that this is more of a political fight than a numbers game?
I've said this before. I know you agree with me. The number one problem facing the state is the budget deficit. And everybody should be focused on solving the problem of the budget deficit. My view is you can't do it on cuts alone. There has to be a balanced approach. Some cuts, some new revenue. That's what we should all be doing. We should be at work to try and solve that problem.
Well, what would be left to cut if all the money is going out the door?
Here again, as I said previously, I would prefer that the governor, working cooperatively with the legislature, would be solely responsible for the management of state government. That's my preference. At the same time, we have these consent decrees. We have these orders that Rauner agreed to and sought in St. Clair County. So they're there. And to the best of our ability, we have to work with them, work our way through them, and hopefully solve the problem of the budget deficit.
Leader Durkin says that he thinks this was basically Democrats' plan from the onset to make Governor Rauner look ineffective and seem like he couldn't win, that this is kind of a long strategy toward his defeat come the next election.
Yeah. Speaking for myself, and I'm not seeking disagreements with Mr. Durkin, I think that he's done a very good job as the minority leader, and he's been very cooperative on matters in the House of Representatives. But speaking for myself, our responsibility is to solve the problem of the budget deficit. I'm not here to think in terms of the election of November of 16 or the election of November of 18. Both of those elections are a long way away. What's really important is that everybody come together and solve the problem of the budget deficit. And my record over the last several months is real clear. The House sent a spending plan to the governor. It was a spending plan that helped and protected middle-class families by providing help and subsidy to local police and fire departments, local school districts, local road programs. It was a good, solid spending plan that would help and protect middle-class families in Illinois.
Why move Amendment 3 then? Based on this, it contributes to a deficit.
Well, it goes back to my view that The number one problem facing the state is the budget deficit, and to solve that budget deficit problem, we have to have a balanced approach. Some cuts, some new revenue. I've said that publicly. I'm not hiding on this. I mean, you can find a lot of Republicans here in the Capitol building, they'll whisper to you, oh, we know that we need new revenue. You know, they whisper and they look around to make sure that Rauner's not watching them. But I'm open and public about it. State needs more money.
Why hasn't the Democratic caucus then brought up any pieces of legislation involving revenue this summer?
Because we're prepared to work cooperatively with the governor, balanced approach to the budget deficit problem, and when the governor's ready to negotiate with the governor on the question of new revenue for the state. There's two elements that are needed, some cuts, some new revenue. In terms of the revenue, we're prepared to work with the governor and to negotiate with the governor to get the job done.
Speaker, why call this property tax bill 12 times? We've kind of discussed it before, but this, you know, and Republicans say it's to have a mailer, but there have already been mailers about they voted against the property tax. There's been no change in the vote. So like, what is the point of kind of the repetition?
It's just to make sure they understand that they have this opportunity. 12 times. They've had an opportunity to vote to freeze real estate taxes. Okay? I think it's significant that not too many of them are voting no, right? You know, they may not vote or they vote present, but they're not voting no. And so they've had 12 opportunities, and they may get more.
But they say that vote's a sham because the bill's not their bill, it's not sponsored by a Republican. So why not put the pressure on them to vote on their actual bill and have it fail?
Well, you know, the other component of the bill that you're referring to has been offered as an amendment. And they don't vote for that either, because that's the element of the bill that would repeal collective bargaining and the prevailing wage. They don't vote for that either. See, they're just not voting for anything. But the opportunity is there. If you listen to Governor Rauner, one of his main points is to freeze real estate taxes. But the Rauner Republicans in the House on 12 occasions have declined to take advantage of that opportunity. Well, listen, Steve is giving you people the heave-ho. And it's always nice seeing you.
Favorite fair food? Favorite fair food? What is your favorite fair
The state
food?
fair, what do you like to, oh, in the microphone, come on. It's a good question, that's new.
See you next week, everybody.
Do they have apples out there?